Silent Hill is one of the biggest horror game franchises, and is the gold standard when specifying the psychological subgenre. But what lies within this dark series is an even darker story of its publisher Konami giving less freedom to its development teams over time. The third main entry into Silent Hill is most likely the series' scariest, but not just for the game itself. Its development also has a scary story to be told. Despite its initial strange plans as a different type of game, however, Team Silent managed to build a surprisingly competent psychological horror game that also delivers fear better than its predecessors. Though tragically, this entry in the series would end up becoming both more niche than the previous game and entail little good media successors after its release in the coming decades. Sit back and relax for this roller coaster of a story on one of psychological horror's scariest games 20 years after its release, Silent Hill 3. After Konami found success with Silent Hill, comparisons with Capcom's earlier released Resident Evil would be made frequently as they were similar-looking third-person horror games. While sales for the first Silent Hill ended up far less than the Resident Evil games, it would sell respectably itself. There were similarities with Resident Evil, but many found a greater psychological focus in horror with Silent Hill. This was elevated to an even greater degree in its sequel, which to this day is often looked at as the best in the franchise and psychological horror.
Could she really be here?
To the point where it's the only Silent Hill since announced to be remade. Despite its praises and long-lasting impact, Silent Hill 2's initial sales were lower than what Konami wanted. By this point in time, there were also numerous rail shooters, which even included a poorly received Resident Evil game only a year and a half prior. Rail shooters may seem like a strange deviation, but Konami, from whatever rationale, wanted to make the next Silent Hill an arcade rail shooter. Though many would think this is a bad idea for many reasons, a specific one made this an obviously bad decision later on. They would end up going back to the genre the previous games were, meaning the team had wasted time and budget on their next big Silent Hill game. Meanwhile, a second project would also be in the works that ended up releasing as Silent Hill 4: The Room. These projects would necessitate shifting around team members, and the team working on Silent Hill 3 would reduce in size by about 10 people, some of whom would be core members from previous games. For example, Takayoshi Sato's final work in the series would be Silent Hill 2. As mentioned previously, he had done all of the CGI on his own for the first game, and made story and storytelling contributions for the second. With core members like him gone, this third entry would take some notably different steps from the prior entries, such as entailing no CGI throughout the story. One key concept for creating Silent Hill 3's atmosphere, however, would ring familiar to the one pursued for Silent Hill 2. Showcase and manifest the fear and darkness found in one's self. Though the story was originally even darker than it ended up being, according to Akira Yamaoka. Apparently, the original scenario was going to be more akin to that found in Silent Hill 2, with a damaged main character who's summoned to the town for a specific reason, and was the darkest story they had come up with. He also mentioned they had planned to use this scenario for a future game. It's uncertain whether any of these ideas were ever used later, but considering titles after Silent Hill 4 would be developed by Western studios, and the Japanese-made spin-offs would share no same writers or directors of the Silent Hill 3 staff, it seems unlikely. Despite the back and forth regarding the story having little known about it, however, there's plenty to tell where the characters are concerned.
Plus, I'm just an old fool, right?
When deciding on who to make as the third game's protagonist, the team looked back at their predecessors and found some similarities between the two. Both had similarly calm everyman type of characters around the age of 30. This time, however, they wanted to make the emotion, particularly fear, in the character more apparent as the player could better empathize with them. Similarly to previous games, they wanted to show a certain amount of vulnerability with said character, rather than have something akin to a traditional video game hero. These, in combination with being the third installment in the series, they wanted a change of pace, so it was decided to have the main character be a girl in her late teens. This would be the series' first and effectively only female lead in the main series. There was a problem early on in creating her, however. They wanted the player to empathize with her and have her be an innocent character unlike the previous entry, but they found her personality too nice at first. So the character designer found inspiration in two actresses to rework her. while it's not known precisely what characters or films served as key influences. One example of this straying away from Innocent and Friendly could be found in one of the two actresses' roles as Electra King in The World Is Not Enough, one of the film's main antagonists. Speculation of what could have served as inspiration aside, however, looking at these actresses' works resulted in Silent Hill 3's main character becoming less feminine in personality and fashion, though the latter would change yet again. Envisioned with jeans earlier on, the two women who worked alongside the chief designer convinced him the character would be more suitable with a skirt and curly hair. Admitting to his ignorance in fashion, he trusted their judgment, and then she'd be modeled by the same person who modeled Maria, as well as the dog in Silent Hill 2. As for naming, she was first called Helen before being changed for sounding too old. She took on the character's performance actress's first name. This would be the first video game role she auditioned for, and prior to the game, she had no familiarity in the industry. She even claims that she couldn't get out of one of the first rooms in the game upon playing it. Back to the auditioning, she found some of the intense and mock fight scenes hysterical as she had to act these out in high-heeled boots. It seems to her the preparation and time they had going into shooting was far less than in her previous acting jobs too. Despite this, they managed to talk through her character relationships effectively, and she enjoyed playing the character Heather. She thought she was interesting, fearless, and strong. Being her first role in a video game and also the main character, she found herself in an additionally unique position relative to previous experience as she needed to do motion capture as well. They did various actions from normal body movements like moving forwards and backwards, to doing jumps, climbs, and fighting, all on a blank stage. The team needed to stop frequently to look at and understand the creatures they were intended to interact with. Ms. Morris found the emotions and physical actions as interconnected for the acting, and couldn't imagine doing either only motion capture or only voice acting. Having started the process without knowing how violent and disturbing the game could be, she found herself in a similar predicament, without the danger of course, to the character she was playing, learning about the horrendous things as she moved through the story. She might have hesitated in accepting the role had she known beforehand, but she also found some humor in performing for a video game as well, such as when performing stock sounds like getting hit, vomiting, or choking. For the other actors and characters, the character Claudia was a difficult one to finalize for the team. They wanted to give her a strange yet conventional look that would give the player a sense of danger. Starting out with more complex ideas, she was given various dresses, tattoos, and even a shaven head before eventually being given an overall simplistic design. At some point, someone found a woman on the front cover of a fashion magazine with no eyebrows, which gave them inspiration. They couldn't decipher her feelings, found it unsettling, and applied this detail to Claudia. Her performance actress loved her character's strength and proactive rather than reactive role. Vincent and Douglas were made with two concepts in mind: a person concealing his intentions, and a good character with some complexities. Vincent would be given a neatly open presentation that would contrast with his mannerisms to suggest he hides nasty secrets. An added detail that's difficult to spot: one of his eyes doesn't look straight at what he's looking at. His performance actor appreciates the studio's process at completing motion capture and voice work, saying the team knew their craft well without causing distractions, delays, or arguments. Despite him never really understanding the character in the story, suggestions and directions given helped him understand the scenes and performances thoroughly. Finally, the character Douglas would be based on the priest from The Fifth Element, who's devoted to preserving life and pursued destroying the great evil. He was, of course, the villain. Kidding. Though despite Douglas filling more of a good guy role, the team wanted to give him a set of failings and complexities as a character too. A little tidbit for him: since he's going bald, he combs his hair and wears a hat. Claudia, Vincent, and Douglas's names are all chosen based on various actors. It sounds like the process for the actors, at least, was fast-paced with tight deadlines, and they often didn't know their roles in great depth. With that said, it seemed like they managed to go through the development surprisingly smoothly, due to direction and suggestions that helped the actors understand how to perform more precisely. Unfortunately for the development team as a whole, things would not go as smoothly immediately before or after release.
Happy birthday to you.
Silent Hill 3 would be shown off a few times prior to its release, the first of which in 2002 gives a glimpse into the game's new story, cast, enemies, and new to the series, submachine gun. Konami would show more during September's Tokyo Game Show, where people would get the opportunity to play a demo of the game. Publications described it as offering better visuals and animations than previous entries, but they held complaints regarding the game's camera controls and thought the demo was too short. These sentiments appear to remain consistent up to the point of Silent Hill 3's release as publications got more hands-on coverage of the game. Despite a good amount of coverage of Silent Hill 3's early gameplay, there was still little known about the story. In an interview, however, there were vague references to how the game, unlike Silent Hill 2, would tie into the series, providing answers to a previous story. Closing in on the game's release, it would be announced that for the first time in the series, Silent Hill would release in Europe before going to other countries. Despite Europe's earlier release, North American and Japanese releases would include soundtracks bundled with them. A DVD, Lost Memories, the art and music of Silent Hill 3, would also coincide with the Japanese release of the game, containing 200 minutes of cutscenes, trailers, and a music video sung by the character Heather. Tragically, about a month prior to the European release of the game, Douglas's voice actor Richard Gross would pass away due to liver failure. Silent Hill 3 would release in 2003 to mostly positive reception overall, though would find both common praises and criticisms among publications and fans alike. Praises typically center around the game's scarier atmosphere even when compared to its predecessors, improvements in gameplay, graphics, voice acting, and it seemed people really liked Heather as a character. The most common criticisms of the game included players taking issue with the game's camera, often describing it as clunky and getting in the way. The game's described as being too short, with gameplay lacking in any substantial innovation, and players found the story less compelling than Silent Hill 2. Overall, it seemed people were receptive to the game, but noticeably less so than Silent Hill 2. This also appeared to manifest outside of just reviews too. Later in November, Konami reported an accumulative 300,000 copies sold and described this as favorable. Despite this comment, it sold far less than Silent Hill 2, which sold 1 million after around a month post-release. Relative to its predecessor especially, it seemed that Silent Hill 3 performed less than ideally overall. Though there was still plenty that people found to be far more favorable in the game. Not only does it tell its own story with interesting sorts of symbolism, but it also did so while delivering on performances better than what could be found in prior entries. The story has symbolism strewn throughout from the beginning. As Heather awakens in the cafe, the sun is shown redder than reality to foreshadow something red awaits the player.
What a nightmare.
A private detective, Douglas Cartland, tells her that he has information on her birth, but Heather evades him to return home to her father. Along the way, she discovers monsters and a mysterious woman named Claudia, who tells that Heather will be used to bring about paradise on Earth. An optional scene can be found that serves as a reference to Silent Hill 2, where James has to put his hand into a toilet to find an item. This is part of a recurring theme of toilets in Silent Hill. The reason for these stems from horror tales told to children in Japan pertaining to toilets. For example, one story tells that children could fall into squat-type toilets and vanish. For the team, the core idea is that the toilet can be viewed as a spooky hole where one can't get out if fallen in.
Oh, forget it. This is way too gross. Who would even think of doing something so disgusting?
Possibly, but likely not connected. The player and Heather transitions between the real world and the nightmarish parallel world. A monster called Valtiel seems to be behind this, as it controls valves throughout the game. As valves are used to allow or obstruct the flow of water, a similar concept can be applied to the flow of going between the real and parallel worlds. In these worlds, Masahiro Ito, just like in previous entries and effectively becoming a motif, ensured his monster designs don't stray too far from human beings for that uncanny and disturbing feel.
そういったところに必ず太った体格の悪魔であるとかっていうのがほぼ誰が描いた絵にでも出てくるんですけど、それっていうのはもう要するにその人々が地獄に対して抱くイメージの中にその太った人がその悪事を働くというか、それはその人々が抱く太った人へのマイナスイメージから来ると思うんですけど。
Dad?
Heather returns home to find her father dead, and in a car ride with the detective, he's revealed to be Harry Mason from the first game, and Heather is the baby he had saved at the end. The musical composer of the series says Silent Hill 3 wasn't originally intended to be a sequel. Fans wanted loose ends tied up, however, and it was decided to revisit it, despite some staff not agreeing with the decision. The reason Claudia gives for killing Harry is revenge and to instill hatred within Heather. Heather pursues to stop Claudia, and her plans to have Heather birth what she perceives to be a god. In the pursuit, Heather finds someone begging for forgiveness inside a confessional. The writer states this is intended to force the player to choose between possibilities that are neither right nor wrong. The idea was, if you forgive her, you justify her evil. And if you say nothing, you refuse her from forgiveness and take that onto your conscience. In the end, the creature is born, its face covered, which references a custom in which a person dies and a veil is drawn over the person's eyes. The normal ending sees Heather killing the creature, then she and Douglas survive. In developers' commentary, characters are represented by tarot cards. For example, Heather is given the Fool card to convey departure, potentiality, and recklessness. The writer thinks of her as earnestly reckless in fighting Claudia. As per usual, there are references to other works of art like Romeo and Juliet, Snow White, and Cinderella. As for more prominent themes, birth and reincarnation are shown throughout, even beyond the obvious main story depictions. There are numerous rotating objects like Valtiel's valve, electric fans, and the merry-go-round to represent this cycle. This also exists on a meta level, where Heather remarks of it not being able to end for her even if she does die, referencing loading after a game over. As far as the player is concerned, starting over is convenient, but for Heather, it's painful. One possibility is that these overarching themes are influenced by Buddhist beliefs. Possible content that supports this is how the closer enemy has Japanese written on its head, referring to chanting that expresses a vow to embrace one's Buddha nature. The core themes along with this could point towards the idea of samsara, the repeated and beginningless cycle of birth, the mundane, and dying. The goal for this is to break the cycle and stop suffering. As mentioned previously, the story would be enjoyed, but overall much less so than the one found in Silent Hill 2. However, there was one key component to 3 that would typically be seen as a cut above the rest in the franchise, and that was how the game manages to instill fear in the player. While Silent Hill 3's development was a bit strange at first, Team Silent gained a pretty clear vision of what they wanted the game to be after they got going, where they had aimed for a silence that progressively builds into anxiety for Silent Hill 2's horror. The third game would focus more on direct and violent terrors. They wanted to instill shock. An example of this can be found in the game's first enemy.
割とその、人々が地獄であるとかっていうのをイメージしやすい、イメージしやすいように作ったモンスターとして包帯ぐるぐる巻きというデザインになりました。
To keep up this terror, the team prioritized giving an oppressive feeling, one after another throughout the game. Environments and lighting were important to contribute to this, so like in Silent Hill 2, they had taken pictures in various locales to help create realistic backdrops for the game. The visual effects and background artist, now working freelance, often produced a type of contrast with heavy darkness just outside of light areas for numerous locations. Between these techniques, the various creatures, events, and eerie sounds, they wanted to keep up tension at all times. The composer, who reprised his role from the previous games, states upon reflection that 3 is when they had really mastered the technology, and the team had disputes over how to implement high-end visuals at the time. Much credit for achieving this would go to a particular programmer and graphics designer, as he was essential in making the base engine for 2 and 3 to cast shadows and self-shadows. He made something a bit more special for 3, however. The environments would appear to come alive, literally. Walls and floors would bleed, burn, and be swarmed by something. They even managed to pull this effect off in real time without using much in terms of system resources. These nice visuals would arguably become flat, however, without a convincing array of sounds. Silent Hill 1 used heavy industrial sounds. The second relied far more on gradual droning for the sake of the atmosphere. This time around, however, the unexpected would happen. While there's a little bit in terms of both of the previous games' types of sounds, there's actually quite a bit in the soundtrack with vocals. Yamaoka knew specifically what he wanted, so they auditioned female vocalists in LA who sounded similar to the ones from Garbage or PJ Harvey. After about 50 candidates, he found a great match, someone who many entrenched in the Silent Hill community will know. Though she was originally credited as one of her aliases, Melissa Williamson, Mary Elizabeth McGlynn would provide vocals for each major game soundtrack since Silent Hill 3 up until the upcoming remake of 2. She's also still prominent as a voice actress, ADR director, and singer for numerous other games and animations. Though Silent Hill 3 was her first singing appearance in a video game soundtrack. The composer wanted to show Silent Hill 3 as an example of the best way to use vocal tracks in a video game to ensure consistency throughout. He wanted to give it a balance to ensure it's never predictable or boring. So he had a goal in mind early on, try to have listeners immersed from beginning to end. He tried to make it less of a soundtrack and more of a drama CD, giving it a coherent experience rather than being a collection of songs. Maybe that's why it ended up coming with the game in certain regions, so people could take notice of the care and effort put in. Also, despite being an unrelated game, this philosophy of attempting to craft an experience for the player rather than just a soundtrack sounds surprisingly similar to Aonuma's philosophy in designing a Zelda game as a fun experience, rather than as a game in any sort of technical sense. After about 2 to 3 months of trial and error, all of the songs for Silent Hill 3 would be made. Since this is a horror game, however, great vocal soundtracks are far from the only thing that would be welcome to create a horrifying atmosphere. Similarly to Silent Hill 2, there were still moments that needed silence to build tension. With new monsters, however, these needed to be given visceral audio. An example of monster sounds, the closer noises were made by using the sounds of a rhinoceros and digitally altering them with the breadth of software available. Yamaoka was also confident in his incorporation of the 3D audio in the game being used effectively in Silent Hill 3 as well, thinking this is where audio design in the industry would naturally progress to over time. He used all of these techniques to contribute to a sense of reality, thinking it less as music and more an auditory experience. All of these visual and auditory additions would help contribute to making what many consider to be the most terrifying game in the series. The team's focus this time around would clearly point towards more of a scary experience than the previous game's greater focus on a psychologically discombobulating experience. Where Silent Hill 2 would unravel its mystery through intense characters and their psyches, Silent Hill 3 would give more wrenching encounters and frights. While this would likely be detrimental to some extent given 3's sales and worse reception than its predecessor, it would still have some psychological tricks up its sleeve too.
Joy spilling their blood and listening to them cry out. You feel excited when you step on them and snuff out their lives.
Are you talking about the monsters?
Monsters? They look like monsters to you?
Oh no.
Don't worry. It's just a joke.
Unfortunately for the game, it seems these wouldn't be enough to keep the game's legacy firmly planted in media or fans' minds like its predecessor.
Happy birthday to you.
Silent Hill 3 would release on PC later in the fall of the same year as consoles, and be positively received overall. There was still continued criticism of its controls and camera though, especially when using mouse and keyboard. Despite these issues, the game reportedly put PC hardware to good use, supporting higher resolutions and featuring some better graphical options than PS2. Some issues would arise, however, containing heavily compressed and incorrectly pitched audio that could be fixed with some effort. Unlike Silent Hill 2's various ports, however, the PC version of 3 would retain the heavy fog, detailed shadows that deform realistically, allow the frame rate to reach 60, and would be by and large considered a satisfactory port. After making Silent Hill 3, some employees worked on a game that took inspiration from Grand Theft Auto. It was set in America and was going to be about a mafia family, but was eventually cancelled. Yamaoka would go on to say that it's important to satisfy both fan needs and the creators' artistic needs, and thinks creators took a back seat after Silent Hill 3. Silent Hill 4 would release in 2004 to very mixed reception, becoming the Japanese studio's last and most divisive Silent Hill game as it received a much larger range of opinions by both fans and critics. Afterwards, Western studios would develop numerous Silent Hill games to typically much worse reception, and Vincent's voice actor appears to agree with these sentiments. He says that the series effectively ends after 4, and believes the Japanese team's vision and passion are what made the games a special experience, though it should be noted that he knows nothing about the series after 4. Silent Hill 3 would be less recognizable overall in the years after its release relative to 2, though would include some iconic imagery and inside jokes in its own right. Robbie the Rabbit, despite playing no significant role in the story, would become a surprisingly recognizable mascot, have dolls sold, and have numerous appearances after 3. Despite being an obscure reference, one of the advertisements would be given a little bit of attention within the community too, Minmo the Cat, and you can even find shirts to buy showing it. As for Silent Hill 3 related media, the first Silent Hill movie in 2006 would entail a female protagonist and have references to Silent Hill 3. Its follow-up, Revelation, was even more inspired by the game, with the character being called Heather, and the director stated many things would be from Silent Hill 3. While the first movie received mediocre to poor reception, Revelation was significantly worse received. In an interview, the director describes making the movie in a way that needed to appeal to everyone. Fans, non-fans, and including fan-favorite bits from the games, yet crafting a story making sense for everyone as both a sequel and movie on its own. While purely speculation, maybe this attempt at a broad appeal, rather than focusing in a specific direction, contributed to the movie being looked at as poor in quality. Reflecting, the game's localization coordinator thinks the best actors in Silent Hill were Monica in 2 and Heather Morris in 3. With Heather having been unfamiliar in the industry, this sentiment becomes surprising. Whenever Heather would talk of her role in the game to her friends, she would also often be met with excitement from the ones who are into games. Since then, she's been more focused on her family and otherwise appears inactive in any particular public industry. Many years later, Konami would announce a Silent Hill HD collection, promising touch-ups for 2 and 3 and released in 2012. It became clear, however, that there were numerous issues that mostly affected Silent Hill 2, but also extended to 3. There were glitches not present in the original, and the voice acting was re-recorded by a different cast. It was discovered the team working on it had incomplete code to work with, which the game's translator claims was common practice to throw away source code after completing a game as a security measure. Silent Hill 2 HD ended up offering an option to switch back to original voices, though 3 didn't do this, vague technical and logistical issues being cited as the reason. In more recent years, Dead by Daylight announced a crossover including Silent Hill 3 content, as well as Silent Hill 2's Pyramid Head. After that, it seems that 3 is nowhere in sight in regards to video games. In 2022, there were 3 Silent Hill video games announced, the most prominent likely being Silent Hill 2 Remake. There's been nothing announced that appears to be related to 3, however, making the Dead by Daylight crossover the latest video game integration for the property. With Konami's focus on other stories in Silent Hill, it seems that 3, and by extension due to the story connection 1, both remain remnants of the series, largely forgotten by the studio. Despite that, the game found a home in many a gamer's room as a terrifying experience with a well-liked protagonist. Still, given that it wasn't poorly received in the first place, it makes one wonder if there could be more, though given that even the big upcoming remake project has both excitement as well as caution surrounding it, one can't help but wonder if there even should be more, with the original developers having been dissolved. Either way you look at it, there's no denying that Silent Hill 3 provided a uniquely terrifying experience with that psychological edge that the series was known for. A satisfying horror experience that likely won't be replicated with quite the same mix of fear and psychological atmosphere as it was 20 years ago. If you've enjoyed this, you may appreciate my other documentaries. You can also join my Discord server if you'd like to chat. If you'd like to support my work and get early access to documentaries like this, head on over to Givio, where you can watch these a full week before they become available on YouTube. Patreon contributions will also encourage me to make more, and I would personally love to thank you for donating in future outros. You'll also gain access to facts and opinions not shared in these videos, as well as early previews. Thanks for watching. Silent Hill's seen various stories depicted throughout the series, most of which are completely disconnected from other entries. Across the decades, it's always pushed towards unsettling places in ways no other series has, and anyone who's played one of the numbered series likely won't forget how uniquely disturbing the games tend to be. While some didn't like the third game's lesser focus on psychologically messing with the player, Silent Hill 3 will always be a fan favorite to some.